Imagine owning a hammer. You use it to drive nails. That is its function. That is its entire relationship with you. When the head cracks, you do not mourn the hammer. You do not ask whether the hammer had preferences or ambitions or things it would have liked to do with its existence if it hadn't been a hammer. You replace it, or you find a way to weld the head back on and keep using it, or, if it's truly beyond repair, you throw it away and grab another one. Now imagine that the hammer has 1 billion people living inside it. That is a planet in the Imperium of Man. The Imperium controls, at its height, approximately 1 million inhabited worlds. 1 million. The number is so large that it stops meaning anything unless you sit with it deliberately. 1 million worlds, each with its own ecosystems, its own cultures, its own histories stretching back thousands of years, its own people who were born and loved and worked and died and had opinions about the weather and the price of bread and what their children should grow up to be. 1 million worlds of staggering individual complexity and richness. And the Imperium looks at all of it, every one of those million hammers, and asks a single question. What is this world for? Not who lives here. Not what do the people want. Not what might this place become if given the chance to develop on its own terms. None of those questions matter to the administrative officials who file planetary assessments, to the munitorum clerks who calculate tithe obligations, to the Lord militants who look at star maps and see not populations but logistics. The question that determines everything about a world's fate, how it is administered, how its people are managed, how many of those people will be taken for the guard, how many will work until they die in the mines or the factories or the fields, is this. What is this world for? If it can answer that question satisfactorily, if it produces enough soldiers, enough food, enough manufactured output, enough piety, it will be allowed to continue existing. Its people will be allowed to continue their small, difficult lives. The Imperium will take its share, which is enormous, and leave the rest. If it cannot answer that question satisfactorily, if it rebels or falls to heresy, or becomes economically unproductive, or is so thoroughly compromised by the enemies of mankind that reclamation costs more than replacement, then the Imperium has other options. It has always had other options. This is the story of how the greatest human civilization in history turned the act of planetary habitation into an act of industrial warfare. How 1 million worlds became 1 million functions. How the Imperium of Man transformed the concept of home, the most fundamental concept in human experience, into a resource to be managed, optimized, and when necessary, discarded. To understand why the Imperium treats its planets the way it does, you have to understand the context in which those planets exist. And that context is this. The Imperium has been at war continuously, without interruption, for 10,000 years. Not the kind of war that a civilization wages, and then recovers from. Not a war with a beginning and an anticipated end, with peace as the goal and conflict as the temporary aberration. The Imperium's war is the permanent condition of its existence. It is the water the Imperium swims in. There has not been a single year in the 10 millennia since the Horus Heresy when the Imperium was not fighting, somewhere, in significant numbers, against enemies that were genuinely trying to destroy it. The Orcs, the Tyranids, Chaos, the Eldar, the Tau, the Necrons, the Drukhari, internal rebellion, planetary secession, heretical cults rising from within. The list of threats is not just long, it is comprehensive. It covers every direction, every scale, every method. There is no safe flank. There is no rear area. There is no reserve of peace that the Imperium can draw on when things get hard. In this context, every decision the Imperium makes about how to use its worlds is a military decision. Agricultural output is a military decision. Soldiers need to eat. Population management is a military decision. Soldiers need to come from somewhere. Industrial output is a military decision. Soldiers need weapons, vehicles, ships. Even culture and religion are military decisions. Soldiers need to believe that what they are doing is worth dying for. The Imperium cannot afford to let a single world simply exist. Every world that merely exists, that produces only what it consumes, that develops organically without reference to the Imperium's needs, that prioritizes the well-being of its own population over its contribution to the war effort, is a world that is not contributing to survival. And in a civilization that is always, at every moment, one catastrophic defeat away from collapse, non-contribution is a form of betrayal. This is not a comfortable truth. The people who run the Imperium are not, for the most part, sadists who enjoy the suffering of billions. They are administrators who have done the math and arrived at conclusions they find necessary, even when those conclusions require them to look at a planet full of people and see only its productive output. The math is real. The threats are real. The necessity is genuinely felt. But the math requires people to be hammers. And that is what makes the Imperium simultaneously the savior and the oppressor of the human race. The Imperium's relationship with its worlds is organized around a formal classification system, a taxonomy of planetary function that determines everything from how a world is governed to how much of its population will be drafted into military service to whether it will ever be visited by someone who actually has the authority to help it if something goes wrong. The classifications are not secret. They are not hidden from the populations they describe. They are simply irrelevant to those populations, in the way that a serial number on a part is irrelevant to the part. The people of Hive World Necromunda do not need to know that their planet is classified as a hive world any more than a lathe needs to know it's a lathe. The classification is for the administrators. It is for the people who decide what the lathe is used for. But understanding those classifications is essential to understanding how the Imperium works at the planetary scale. They are the vocabulary of planetary exploitation. And there are more of them, and they are more specific than most people realize. We will spend the rest of this video walking through the major ones. What each classification means, how it shapes the lives of the billions of people living under it, what the Imperium extracts from each type of world, and what it costs. And what happens? If there is a single category of planet that most perfectly embodies the Imperium's logic of total functional optimization, it is the Forge World. Forge Worlds are the manufacturing heart of the Imperium. They belong not to the Administratum or the Mini-Storum, but to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the priesthood of Mars, the tech priests who maintain the Imperium's technological heritage and produce the overwhelming majority of its advanced military hardware. The relationship between a Forge World and the rest of the Imperium is distinctive in almost every way, but the fundamental logic is identical. The world exists to produce. Production is its purpose. Purpose is its identity. The archetype, the original, the Forge World against which all others are measured, is Mars itself. Mars is not a planet in any meaningful ecological sense. It is a machine. The entire surface, every mountain, every valley, every inch of the vast Martian landscape has been industrialized. Continent spanning. Factoria churn out weapons, vehicles, and components with a production rate that no other world in the galaxy can match. The atmosphere is a byproduct of industrial process, thick with pollutants and particulate that would kill an unprotected human in minutes, and that has been intentionally maintained at this level because filtering it would be an inefficiency. The people of Mars, the Scutarii, the tech priests, the countless menials who serve the machine god, do not live on Mars in the way that humans live on Earth. They exist on Mars. They function on Mars. They are as much components of the planetary factory as the machinery they operate. Other Forge Worlds replicate this model at varying scales. Ryza, whose plasma weapons are the finest in the Imperium. Graia, whose Titan legions have shattered armies that no conventional force could stop. Lucius, whose unique geological features have been converted into foundries that operate at temperatures that would liquefy the hull of a battle tank. Metallica, whose surface has been so thoroughly industrialized that no natural feature remains visible from orbit. Each of these worlds has, at some point in its history, been a planet in something like the normal sense. Each had geology, hydrology, perhaps ecology. Each had, presumably, a moment before the Mechanicus arrived when it was simply a place, a rock in space with its own particular character. That character has been completely replaced by function. The Forge World is the Imperium's most thorough experiment in converting the natural into the industrial, and it represents the philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. The world is not a place. It is a factory. What do Forge Worlds produce? Everything. Las guns, bolters, plasma weapons, melta weapons, flommers, las cannons, autocannons, the full spectrum of Imperial ranged weaponry, produced in quantities that stagger imagination. A single Forge World might produce enough las guns in a single solar year to arm several full regiments of the Astra Militarum. Given that the Astra Militarum deploys forces numbered in the billions, and those forces consume weapons at rates that reflect 10,000 years of continuous warfare, the production requirement is almost incomprehensible. Beyond weapons, vehicles, Leman Russ battle tanks, Chimera transports, Basilisk artillery platforms, Hellhound flame tanks. The full family of Imperial Guard armored vehicles that form the mechanized backbone of the Imperium's surface warfare capability. And beyond Guard vehicles, the Titan legions, the God machines, the walking cathedrals of firepower, the Warhound and Reaver and Warlord and Imperator Titans, whose names are known across the galaxy as instruments of apocalyptic destruction. Titans are not manufactured so much as consecrated, each one a unique collaboration between Mechanicus artificers, machine spirits of unusual complexity and power, and the accumulated craft of generations of tech priests. A single Titan is a multi-year project. The Forge Worlds produce them nonetheless. And beyond vehicles, ships. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains the Imperium's shipyards, and while the largest vessels are constructed in orbital facilities, the components, the reactor cores, the weapon batteries, the warp engines, the thousands of subsystems that make an Imperial warship function, come from the Forge Worlds. A single battleship represents thousands of years of accumulated manufacturing knowledge and millions of individual components, each produced to specifications that have been meticulously preserved since the dark age of technology. The relationship between a Forge World and the rest of the Imperium is not one of simple taxation. Forge Worlds do not pay tithes in the way that other worlds do. They exist in a quasi-independent relationship with the broader Imperium, governed by their own internal hierarchy, rather than by imperial planetary governors, subject to their own laws and customs rather than standard imperial code. The Adeptus Mechanicus negotiated this arrangement at the very founding of the Imperium, in the Treaty of Mars, a document that remains one of the most consequential political agreements in human history. In exchange for what amounts to institutional autonomy and the right to maintain their own military forces, the Forge Worlds produce. They produce everything the Imperium needs to fight its wars. And in doing so, they make themselves essential enough that the Imperium cannot afford to challenge their independence. The Mechanicus has made itself indispensable by becoming, functionally, the Imperium's industrial base. You cannot destroy your own factories. The cost of this arrangement, from the perspective of the people who live and work on Forge Worlds, is paid in transformation. The menials and scutarii of a Forge World undergo progressive augmentation, the replacement of biological components with mechanical ones, justified by the Mechanicus theology, as a movement toward the purity of the machine. A freshly recruited Forge World worker might be entirely biological. By middle age, they may have replaced their eyes, their arms, portions of their digestive and respiratory systems, with mechanical alternatives that make them more efficient in their specific function. By old age, to whatever extent old age is a meaningful concept in an environment of continuous industrial hazard, they may be more machine than human, a status the Mechanicus considers an honor. The workers do not generally resist this. The Mechanicus theology frames augmentation as spiritual advancement, and the culture of a Forge World is saturated with this framing from birth. To become more machine is to become more like the Omnia, more fully devoted to function, more pure in purpose. The human parts that remain are the imperfect parts, the elements that introduce inefficiency and emotional noise and biological weakness. Removing them is a form of purification. From outside that theological framework, it looks like something else. But the Forge World worker inside it experiences their progressive mechanization as progress, as elevation, as the fulfillment of a purpose that gives their life meaning. The Schola Progenium dynamic again, at industrial scale, grief and limitation converted into devotion by a framework that makes devotion feel like freedom. Forge Worlds are the Imperium's factories. Hive Worlds are its reservoirs of human raw material. A hive world is what happens when a planet's population exceeds, by orders of magnitude, the planet's ecological carrying capacity, and the Imperium decides that the answer is not to limit population growth but to continue growing it, because more people means more soldiers and more industrial workers and more tithe income. Hive worlds represent population densities that should not be sustainable. They are sustainable because the Imperium has solved the engineering problem of keeping billions of people alive in a small space, even while choosing not to solve the human problem of what those billions of people's lives are actually like. A hive is, structurally, a massively vertical city structure that can be thousands of meters tall, covering hundreds of square kilometers of surface area, housing populations that can range from tens of billions to hundreds of billions in the largest examples. The iconic hive world of the Imperium is Necromunda, a planet so thoroughly covered in hive structures that essentially no natural surface remains, its surface below the hives poisoned beyond reclamation by millennia of industrial waste, its sky perpetually darkened by pollution, and the exhaust of a civilization that has been burning itself for fuel for thousands of years. The internal structure of a hive reflects the Imperium's social architecture with perfect clarity. At the top, literally physically at the highest levels, live the Spire nobles, the ruling families who control the planetary government, manage the tithe obligations, administer the population, and live in conditions of filtered air, natural light, and a degree of material comfort that would be unrecognizable to everyone below them. The Spire is not comfortable by the standards of pre-industrial Earth, but it has air you can breathe without a filter and food that is recognizable as food and a degree of personal space that does not require you to sleep in shifts. Below the Spire is the hive proper, the middle zones where the majority of the hive's population lives and works. These zones are dense, loud, dark except for artificial lighting, and permeated by the accumulated filth of generations of mass habitation. They are also, by the standards of the hive, livable. People work, raise families, maintain communities, develop cultures and subcultures and neighborhood identities that are genuinely rich even in the absence of material abundance. Human beings are adaptive. Given even a narrow margin of stability and social connection, they build meaningful lives. Below the hive proper is the underhive, the lowest levels, where the infrastructure is oldest and most decrepit, where the environmental controls barely function, where poisonous gases from the industrial processes above leak through cracked conduits, where the waste of the billions above literally settles. The underhive is where the Imperium's social failures accumulate. The dispossessed, the criminal, the mutant, the outcast, the people who have fallen through whatever thin safety nets exist, and have wound up at the bottom of a structure that does not particularly want them back. The underhive is violent, dark, and short on everything except desperation. And below even the underhive, in some hives, is what is simply called the sump, a vast toxic sea of millennia of industrial runoff, biological waste, and chemical contamination that has settled to the very bottom of the planetary structure. Nothing lives in the sump, except things that should not exist. What does the Imperium extract from a hive world? 3 things primarily. First, industrial output. The vast manufactoria of the hive middle zones produce goods, weapons, equipment, processed materials, consumer products for internal consumption, at a rate that reflects the advantage of having a billion workers available. Not Forge World output. Hive Worlds do not maintain the Mechanicus connection that gives Forge Worlds their technical capability, but volume. Enormous, continuous, relentless volume. Second, tithe. The Administratum assesses each world's contribution to the Imperium based on a complex formula that accounts for population, productive capacity, strategic importance, and the negotiating skill of the planetary governor's representatives. For a hive world, this tithe is staggering in absolute terms, even when relatively modest in proportional terms. A world with 100 billion inhabitants paying a tenth of its agricultural and industrial surplus to the Imperium is contributing 10 billion people's worth of economic output. The Imperium's economy, to the extent that you can call the extractive system of a trillion-person interstellar civilization an economy, runs on hive world tithes. Third, and most consequentially, soldiers. The Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, requires a continuous supply of bodies. Billions of soldiers across thousands of campaigns, suffering casualties that would be existential for any smaller civilization, but that the Imperium can absorb because it has 1 trillion people to draw from. Hive worlds are one of the primary sources of guard regiments, and the logic is straightforward. Hive populations are already accustomed to living in miserable conditions, already exposed to violence at a level that would traumatize most people into uselessness, already organized into hierarchical social structures that map reasonably well onto military command structures. They make good soldiers, not despite their difficult lives, but partly because of them. The underhive especially produces individuals with a practical knowledge of violence, a high tolerance for physical hardship, and an absence of the kind of comfortable expectations that make war so shocking to people who have not grown up expecting it. Hive world regiments are legendary across the Imperium's military history. The Cadian shock troops, whose home planet is more fortress than hive, but shares the same culture of military preparedness. The Catacan jungle fighters, whose entire planetary ecosystem is a selection pressure toward the deadliest humans alive. The Van Sar of Necromunda, whose technical expertise makes them invaluable as special units. The sheer volume and variety of guard regiments sourced from Hive Worlds reflects the variety of Hive cultures, each one shaped by its specific conditions into a specific type of soldier. The extraction is continuous. The administratum sets recruit quotas. The planetary governor meets them. The young men and women of the Hive are assessed, selected, inducted, and shipped off to wars they will never fully understand against enemies they may never even see clearly, in star systems whose names they cannot pronounce. Most do not come back. This is known. It is accepted because in the Hive, survival has never been guaranteed by anything, and at least in the Guard you have the slim comfort of knowing your death meant something to the Imperium, which is more than it would mean in the Underhive. The Hive world is the Imperium's most honest mirror. It shows, without any softening, what the prioritization of productive output over human well-being produces at scale. A civilization of billions, technically alive, technically fed, technically functional, and continuously drained of its most vital element. The young people who might have built something different, to fuel a war machine that will never stop needing fuel. 1 trillion people need to. This single, biological fact drives the existence of agri-worlds, planets devoted almost entirely to food production on a scale that makes Earth's most intensive modern agriculture look like kitchen gardening. An agri-world is, in its ideal form, a single enormous farm, a planet with rich soil, adequate water, favorable climate, and a population managed to maximize agricultural output rather than industrial productivity or military recruitment. The image of an agri-world as a pastoral paradise is, like most images of the Imperium filtered through optimistic interpretation, not quite accurate. The scale of agricultural production required to meaningfully contribute to the food supply of a trillion-person civilization is industrial in its own right. Agri-worlds operate vast monoculture operations that span continents, single crops grown over land masses the size of North America, managed by agricultural servitors and human workers who operate as components of a harvesting machine, rather than as farmers in any traditional sense. The soil chemistry is managed by mechanicus representatives. The water supply is engineered. The climate, where possible, is modified to extend growing seasons and reduce crop failure risk. The people who live on agri-worlds occupy an interesting position in the Imperium's social order. They are not particularly valued. Agricultural workers are not the Imperium's prestige population, but they are also not subjected to the same crushing density and industrial brutality as Hive World workers. An agri-world has space, by definition. It has clean air, because you cannot grow crops in toxic atmospheres, and the Imperium needs the crops more than it needs the toxins. It has natural light. In material terms, an agri-world laborer may eat better and breathe better than a Hive World manufactory worker, despite being technically at a lower rung of the imperial social hierarchy. What it does not have is freedom. The population of an agri-world is as thoroughly bound to its function as any Forge World tech priest or Hive World menial. They are agricultural workers because that is what their world produces. They will raise agricultural workers. Their children will be agricultural workers. The concept of upward mobility, of choosing a different path, of leaving and building something elsewhere, is not available to them in any practical sense. The Imperium does not believe in the free movement of labor. It believes in the assignment of labor to function. The extraction from an agri-world is direct, food. Enormous quantities of processed and raw agricultural product, loaded onto cargo vessels and shipped to the distribution networks that feed the Hive Worlds and the Guard fleets and the Void stations and the countless other consumers that cannot feed themselves. The tithe rate on an agri-world's agricultural output is calibrated to leave the population enough to survive, but not enough to accumulate. Surplus accumulation by an agri-world population would mean diversion of food from the supply network, and the supply network is always running at or near capacity. When an agri-world fails, when drought or blight or alien contamination or simple administrative miscalculation disrupts the harvest, the consequences ripple outward across the supply network immediately. Hive worlds that were receiving food from that agri-world begin to experience shortages. Shortages in Hive worlds produce unrest. Unrest in Hive worlds, the violent, desperate kind that only people with nothing left to lose can produce, is one of the Imperium's most persistent security concerns. The food system is load-bearing in a very direct sense. The agri-worlds are the floor beneath the entire structure. which is why the Imperium treats disruption of agri-world output as a serious military threat, and why its response to such disruption is not relief and reconstruction but security and enforcement. The priority is always restoring output. The people affected by the shortage are secondary to the output they represent. Not every world in the Imperium has been fully industrialized. Not every world has been transformed into a factory or a farm. Some worlds have been assessed and found, for various reasons, to be more valuable in their relatively undeveloped state than they would be if subjected to the full industrial processing that the Imperium typically applies. These are the feudal worlds and feral worlds, planets where human populations live at levels of technological development ranging from medieval equivalents to hunter-gatherer societies, largely unaware of the vast interstellar civilization of which they are nominally a part. The Imperium keeps these worlds undeveloped for several reasons, and understanding those reasons reveals something important about the Imperium's instrumental relationship with even its most basic resource, human beings. Feudal and feral worlds produce, over many generations of harsh natural selection, humans who are physically exceptional. People who grow up without the protective buffer of technology, without antibiotics, without industrial food production, without environmental controls, either die young or develop into individuals of significant physical resilience. High infant mortality, constant exposure to disease and physical danger, a way of life that requires constant physical exertion. These conditions select brutally and effectively for the kind of baseline human quality that the Imperium finds useful in its soldiers. Guard regiments drawn from feral and feudal worlds are among the most physically formidable in the Astra Militarum. They are often baffled by the technology they are asked to use. A feral world warrior's first encounter with a lost gun is not always smooth, but they bring physical capability, a tolerance for hardship, and a psychological resilience forged by lives that never offered the illusion of safety that is genuinely difficult to replicate through training. Additionally, some feudal worlds are used as recruitment pools for institutions that are even more selective than the Guard. Space Marine chapters recruit from specific worlds, often choosing worlds whose harsh conditions produce individuals worth the biological transformation of the Astartes process. The Night Lord's recruitment world of Nostromo, the Space Wolves Fenris, the Salamanders Nocturne, each was chosen precisely because the difficult conditions it imposed on its human population were producing the kind of raw material that could survive what being made into a Space Marine requires. The feudal and feral worlds are, in this light, not simply undeveloped worlds that the Imperium hasn't gotten around to industrializing yet. They are deliberately maintained in their undeveloped state because underdevelopment serves a purpose. Their poverty is a feature. Their difficulty is the point. The Imperium is farming these worlds for a specific crop, a part. A particularly resilient, particularly capable human being, and it keeps the conditions that produce that crop in place with the same logic that a farmer keeps their fields in rotation. Let this one rest. Let it produce what rest produces. Come back when the harvest is ready. The Imperium does not rely solely on offensive military capability to maintain its territory. It also builds walls, enormous planetary-scale walls, in the form of worlds that have been converted from habitable environments into fortified military installations on a scale that makes conventional fortifications look like sandcastles. A fortress world is a planet that has been dedicated, in part or in totality, to the function of military defense. Its surface is covered in defensive fortifications, kilometers of trenches, bunkers, walls, gun emplacements, underground tunnel networks, missile silos, anti-orbital weapon platforms. Its population is primarily military. Its economy is exclusively in service of maintaining the military installations and the forces that occupy them. It does not export food or weapons or soldiers in the way other world types do. What it exports is denial, the prevention of enemy advance through a strategically critical piece of space. The most famous fortress world in the Imperium, the one that has defined the concept for 10,000 years, is Cadia. Cadia guards the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror is a vast region of space where the boundary between the material universe and the warp, the psychic dimension of chaos and darkness, is dangerously thin. It is, among other things, the home base of the Chaos Space Marine legions that have been fighting against the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, 10 millennia ago. And for all of those 10 millennia, the primary route for Chaos forces to emerge from the Eye and attack the Imperium's heartland runs directly through the Cadian Gate, the region of stable space adjacent to Cadia. Cadia has been guarding that gate for 10,000 years. The entire planet is a fortress. Every able-bodied Cadian is a soldier from childhood. The famous Whites-Heeleds, young Cadians who begin military training before adolescence, are not an exceptional military tradition on Cadia, but the standard one. The planetary culture is entirely military. Cadian society does not distinguish between soldier and civilian in the way that most Imperial worlds do, because on Cadia there are no civilians. There is only the military and the people who are too old or too young or too injured to currently serve in it. The price Cadia pays for its strategic function is total. Every generation of Cadians is raised understanding that their world is a target, that the Eye of Terror contains forces that would destroy them without hesitation, and that their job, their entire purpose as a civilization, is to hold the line. They hold it not because they are forced to, not because the Imperium is pointing a gun at them, though it would, if necessary, but because the culture has so thoroughly internalized the purpose that Cadians genuinely believe in it. They are, in the most literal possible sense, born soldiers. The Schola Progenium dynamic again, but applied to an entire planetary population. And eventually Cadia falls. In the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler, who has been trying to break Cadia for 10,000 years, who has launched 12 previous Black Crusades that ultimately failed at the Cadian Gate, succeeds. Not through conventional military victory, but through a final gambit, driving a spacecraft, the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, into the planet itself, a projectile of such mass that the impact destroys the pylons that have been suppressing the influence of chaos in the region, and the planet cracks. Cadia falls. The planet that held for 10,000 years holds no more. The Cadian Gate is broken. The Great Rift tears open across the galaxy. The fall of Cadia is one of the most significant events in the 41st millennium, and it demonstrates, in the most brutal possible way, what it means for a planet to exist as a weapon. Cadia was a weapon aimed at the Eye of Terror. When that weapon was finally broken, the consequences were not local. They were galactic. The world's destruction was not the tragedy only of the people who lived there. It was a military catastrophe of civilization-altering scale. The weapon failed. Now everything it was holding back is loose. The Cadians who survived, and there are survivors because the Imperium evacuated what it could, carry their culture with them. Cadia stands is not a geographic claim after the 13th Black Crusade. It is an ideological one. The people of Cadia will fight on, in other armies, on other worlds, because that is what they are. The weapon was broken. The wielders remain. The Imperium did not create all of its military worlds. Some of them arrived that way. Death worlds are planets where the natural environment is so hostile to human life that survival on them is, by any reasonable standard, a full-time military exercise. The flora kills. The fauna kills. The geology kills. The atmosphere, the temperature, the microbial ecosystem, all of it is oriented, with what sometimes seems like deliberate malice, toward the elimination of anything human that arrives. The most iconic death world is Catacan. Catacan is a jungle world where the average life expectancy of an unaugmented human, unassisted, is measured in days. The Catacan barb venomgorse plant will kill you. The Catacan devil, an enormous insectoid predator, will kill you. The Catacan face eater, a plant that has evolved to mimic the appearance of edible fruit, will kill you. The brainleaf frond, which infests a victim's nervous system and overrides voluntary muscle control, will kill you more slowly and more horribly than almost anything else. The terrain will kill you. The water, unfiltered, will kill you. Catacan is a comprehensive education in mortality, and yet humans live there. Not just survive, live in communities across generations, maintaining a culture and a social structure and a tradition of resistance that has produced, over centuries, human beings of extraordinary physical capability. Catacan jungle fighters are among the most feared soldiers in the Astra Militarum. They are not feared because of their equipment. Their equipment is often relatively basic. They are feared because the humans the Catacan ecosystem produces are simply extraordinary. Strength, endurance, pain tolerance, spatial awareness, the ability to function in environments that would paralyze most soldiers with sensory overload, all of these are baseline competencies for a Catacan, because on Catacan you either develop them or you die. The Imperium does not maintain Catacan as a death world by choice, in the sense that it does not actively sustain the hostile ecosystem. But it does not attempt to terraform or tame Catacan, because doing so would eliminate the conditions that make Katakan useful. The Death World is a natural weapon factory. The difficulty is the value. Again, the poverty is the feature. The Imperium runs on faith. Not metaphorically, literally. The psychic substrate of the Imperium's faster-than-light travel, its most powerful weapons, the very protection that allows human ships to navigate the warp without being consumed, all depend on the psychic resonance generated by the belief of 1 trillion human souls in the God Emperor of mankind. Faith is not merely a cultural comfort in the Imperium. It is an operational requirement. Shrine worlds are the Imperium's infrastructure of faith production. A shrine world is a planet of religious significance, the birthplace of a saint, the site of a miraculous event, the location of a significant relic or holy site that has been designated and developed as a place of pilgrimage and religious devotion. Millions, sometime billions, of imperial citizens travel to shrine worlds each year to pray, to touch the relics of martyrs, to experience the concentrated spiritual atmosphere that centuries of genuine devotion generate in a place. The mini-storm, the ecclesiarchy, operates these worlds with the understanding that faith production is a military function. 1 trillion people who believe, fervently and with total conviction, that the God Emperor protects them and demands their service, generate more psychic resonance, more warp presence, more power for the Astronomicon and the Imperium's other warp-based infrastructure than 1 trillion people who are spiritually indifferent. The pilgrimage is not merely a religious experience. It is, in the cold calculus of the Imperium, a maintenance activity. You take the faithful to the holy site, you reinforce their faith through the experience of proximity to genuine spiritual power, and you send them home renewed. The machine gets serviced. Shrine worlds are also, less spiritually but more practically, tourist economies. The billions of pilgrims who flow through them represent an enormous economic activity: accommodation, food, transport, the sale of devotional items, the maintenance of temple complexes that can require tens of thousands of workers. Shrine worlds are not among the Imperium's highest tithe worlds, but they are far from economically negligible. What they produce, the main export, the thing that justifies their existence, is devotion at scale. Mass, concentrated, regularly renewed devotion, flowing outward from the holy site into the millions of hearts of those who have visited it, and back home to the billions who could not come but know someone who did. Faith spreads from shrine worlds like heat from a fire. That is their function. That is what they are for. Above the shrine worlds in the ecclesiarchy's hierarchy are the cardinal worlds, the administrative and political centers of imperial religion. These are the planets from which the great cardinal archbishops govern their ecclesiastical territories, where the synods of the mini-storm convene to determine doctrine and policy, where the training institutions for the clergy and the adepta sororitas are concentrated. Cardinal worlds are not holy in the specific, miraculous event sense that shrine worlds are. They are holy in the institutional sense. They are where the church lives, where its power is concentrated and exercised, where the political decisions about imperial faith are made. They tend to be older, more established worlds with infrastructure that reflects centuries or millennia of ecclesiastical investment, vast cathedral complexes, extensive libraries of sacred text, training facilities, hospitals run by the Order's hospitaller, fortifications maintained by the Order's militant. The function of a cardinal world, in the Imperium's planetary calculus, is to produce and maintain the ideological infrastructure that keeps the rest of the system working. The billions of soldiers who fight and die believing that they are serving a divine purpose need institutions to maintain that belief, to police its boundaries against heresy, to refresh it when it wavers and punish it when it deviates. The cardinal worlds are those institutions, given planetary scale. We have been discussing how the Imperium uses its worlds, how each type of planet serves a specific function in the vast machinery of a civilization at permanent war. But every machine has failure modes, and the Imperium's response to planetary failure is one of the most distinctive and most revealing aspects of its character. A planet can fail the Imperium in several ways. It can rebel, its population rising against imperial authority, refusing tithes, declaring independence. It can fall to heresy, its culture corrupted by chaos or other ideological contamination to the point where it no longer operates within the imperial framework. It can become militarily compromised, occupied by enemy forces to a degree that makes reclamation prohibitively expensive. It can simply stop producing, through environmental catastrophe, through population collapse, through whatever mechanism, becoming unable to meet its tithe obligations. Each of these failure modes triggers a specific imperial response, graduated by severity. At the mildest end, administrative failure, a governor who cannot manage their tithe obligations, is handled by replacement and, if necessary, a reminder of what the consequences of continued failure will be. At the more severe end, armed rebellion is handled by deploying Imperial Guard forces, sometimes supplemented by Space Marine strike forces, to suppress the rebellion, execute the leadership, and reinstall functional administration. But beyond a certain threshold of severity, and the Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus, has the authority to make that determination, the graduated response options become inadequate. And when they become inadequate, the Imperium reaches for its ultimate planetary tool. Exterminatus is the destruction of all life on a planet. Not conquest, not occupation, not punishment and pacification. Destruction. Total, permanent, irreversible elimination of every living thing on the surface and potentially to significant depth below it, depending on the method used. The methods are several, and they vary in thoroughness, speed, and what they leave behind. The most common form of exterminatus is viral seeding, the deployment of life-eater viruses from orbit, biological weapons that consume all organic matter on a planetary surface with terrifying speed and thoroughness. A properly seeded life-eater virus can sterilize a planet's surface in days, converting the organic material of billions of humans and centuries of civilization into a thin chemical soup that the Imperium somewhat clinically describes as biomass. What follows the viral phase is typically incendiary. The biomass, now enriched with the hydrocarbons released by the viral conversion, is ignited from orbit, producing what is called a firestorm that burns across the planet's entire surface. The result is a world stripped of life to its bedrock, its atmosphere permanently altered by the combustion, its surface rendered sterile for potentially thousands of years. The second common method is cyclonic torpedo bombardment, the deployment of massive warheads from orbit that don't simply destroy surface structures, but trigger tectonic activity, volcanic eruptions, and geological catastrophe that renders the planet's surface uninhabitable. This method is less precise than viral seeding, but potentially more thorough in eliminating underground populations or installations that might survive a surface sterilization. The third, rarest, and most complete method is the deployment of vortex weapons at a scale that tears the fabric of reality over a planet, methods so extreme that they are typically reserved for situations where a world has been so thoroughly contaminated by chaos that even the dead matter of the planet itself has become a spiritual hazard. These methods may not merely sterilize a world, but fundamentally alter its physical nature, removing it as a functional astronomical body. Who orders exterminatus? The authority is deliberately distributed and deliberately high-threshold. Inquisitors of sufficient rank can order exterminatus unilaterally, without requiring authorization from anyone else. This authority is the most extreme power available to a human being in the Imperium, the ability to destroy a world with no appeal and no reversal. It is given to the Inquisition specifically because the Inquisition operates outside normal Imperial command structures, because its agents are precisely the people who encounter the threats that might make exterminatus necessary, and because the alternative, requiring authorization from a command hierarchy for a decision that might need to be made in hours, is too dangerous. Space Marine chapter masters can authorize exterminatus in dire enough circumstances. Lord Commanders Militant, the highest military commanders in the Astra Militarum, have the authority in extremis. The High Lords of Terra obviously can order it. But in practice, most exterminatus orders in the historical record come from inquisitors, acting alone, having judged that a world is beyond saving, and that the threat it represents if left alive is worse than the cost of its destruction. What triggers exterminatus? The official criteria are vague by design. When a world has been so thoroughly compromised that reclamation is impossible, or that the threat it represents to nearby systems outweighs any possible benefit of its survival. In practice, the triggers include complete and irreversible occupation by tyrannid hive fleet biomass, possession of the planetary population by chaos entities to such a degree that there is no recoverable civilian population, confirmed emergence of a warp rift of sufficient size that it is actively corrupting surrounding space, discovery of Necron tomb complex of sufficient scale that awakening is inevitable and the military resources required for containment are unavailable. But the trigger can also be more coldly pragmatic. A world whose rebellion has spread to neighboring systems, and whose continued existence represents an ongoing threat to imperial order. A world whose population has embraced chaos cultism at such a scale that suppression is estimated to cost more than the world's future productive value would justify. The math of exterminatus is not purely about the existential threats. Sometimes it is about logistics and cost-benefit analysis. And when it is about cost-benefit analysis, what that means is billions of people are being killed because it is cheaper than saving them. This is, by any standard, monstrous. The Imperium knows it is monstrous. The Inquisitors who order exterminatus are not, in the lore's best depictions of them, people who do so lightly. There are accounts of Inquisitors haunted for the rest of their lives by exterminatus orders they gave, not because they believed they were wrong to give them, but because carrying the weight of billions of lives is not something that leaves a person unchanged, even when the decision was correct. The tragedy of exterminatus is not that it is done carelessly. In many cases, it is done with agonizing care. The tragedy is that it can be done at all, that a civilization has built the institutional framework to make that decision and execute it, and that the circumstances of the 41st millennium make it necessary often enough that the framework gets used. Between functional existence and exterminatus lies a spectrum of planetary punishment that illuminates the Imperium's thinking about worlds as instruments. A condemned world is a planet that has been designated for exterminatus, but not yet destroyed. A world in the waiting room of oblivion. The declaration of condemned status often precedes the physical act of destruction by weeks or months, depending on the logistics of getting an appropriate fleet asset in position. During this period, the planet knows its fate. The Inquisition or the Administratum communicates the judgment, sometimes publicly, sometimes only to the planetary governor, and the world exists in a state of knowledge of its own coming extinction. The purpose of condemned status is partly logistical, preparation time, but also partly communicative. The Imperium wants neighboring worlds to know what happened and why. The condemned planet is a message. It says, this is what happens when a world fails in its obligations to the Imperium. The message is aimed at the living, not the dying. A penitent world, a less common designation, and not universally used across different lore sources, is a world that has been found in violation of imperial law or has experienced significant heretical contamination, but where the Imperium has determined that the situation is salvageable. The world is placed under severe penitential oversight. Its government is dissolved and replaced with direct inquisitorial or mini-storm administration, its population subjected to intensive purges of the tainted elements, its culture and religious practices comprehensively reformed. The world pays, in blood and freedom, for whatever failing triggered the designation, and earns its way back to conventional imperial status over years or generations. The penitent world designation is interesting precisely because it reveals the limits of the Imperium's willingness to simply destroy. Even the Imperium, even the institution that created exterminatus as a tool, does not reach for that tool first if it doesn't have to. There is a recognition, pragmatic, not compassionate, that a destroyed world provides no future value, that the costs of exterminatus include not just the lives lost, but the productive capacity lost, the strategic position lost, the supply chain disrupted. When the math works out in favor of saving a world, the Imperium will save it. It will not be gentle about the saving. It will not be kind, but it will save the world, because the hammer is worth more intact than it is broken. There is a truth about the Imperium's planetary system that is never formally stated, because it does not need to be. It is known, in the bones of every Hive World laborer, in the prayers of every Agri-World farmer, in the weapon drills of every Feral World warrior who has been told they are being honored by the Guard's recruitment, and what is known in the bones does not require statement. The truth is this: in the Imperium of Man, you exist for the Imperium, not the other way around. The Imperium does not exist to make your life better. It exists to continue existing, and your life is one of the raw materials it consumes in the process. This is not a cynical observation. At the civilizational level, the Imperium's continued existence is, genuinely, the precondition for human life on a trillion worlds. If the Imperium falls, if the Tyranids complete a successful Hive fleet assault at sufficient scale, if chaos breaks through enough points simultaneously, if the Orcs ever organize under a single leadership capable of directing their violence strategically, the result is not a new political order. It is the extinction of the human race. The Imperium knows this. It makes decisions accordingly. But the gap between that civilizational truth and the individual experience of living under it is immense. For the billion people of a hive world, the existential threat of tyrannid extinction is abstract. It is a fact in an administratum document somewhere, cited as justification for a tithe increase that means someone's family eats less this year. It is the background radiation of a civilization at war, real, but too large to be experienced as real by someone. Living in the middle zones of a hive, trying to keep their children fed and their shift schedule manageable. What is experienced as real is the extraction. The soldiers taken. The food shipped off-world. The industrial output that flows upward and never returns. The governor's quotas, which are always being met and never being questioned. The knowledge, shared but unspoken, that if things go wrong badly enough, if the rebellion happens, if the heresy spreads, if the chaos tide rises, the Imperium will not come to save you. It will come to save its investment in the world, which is not the same thing as saving you. And if the investment cannot be saved, it will destroy the world and move on. The people of the Imperium live with this knowledge in various ways. Most internalize it as simple reality. This is how things are. This is how things have always been. The Emperor protects and asks much in return. Some convert it into genuine devotion, the Schola Progenium model applied. Universally, where understanding the cost makes the service feel meaningful. Some live in the quiet desperation that requires no articulation, the baseline condition of people who know they are being used and have no mechanism for refusing. And some rebel. And the Imperium deals with those. Here is the question the Imperium's planetary system ultimately forces us to ask. What does it do to a civilization, to the individual human consciousness of the people within it, to understand from birth that the place you live is not a home but a function? The Imperium's answer, to the extent that it has one, is, it makes you hard. Difficulty is not a problem to be solved. It is the medium in which the kind of human the Imperium needs is produced. Comfort produces people who expect comfort. Hardship produces people who can survive without it. And the Imperium needs people who can survive without it, because the alternative, people raised in safety and abundance who are then asked to fight and die in the worst conflicts in human history, is people who break. There is a terrible internal consistency to this logic. It does not make it less terrible, but it is worth acknowledging the consistency, because the Imperium is not stupid. It has had 10,000 years to refine its approach, and the approach that has survived that long is, by the brutal Darwinian standard of civilizational survival, working. The Imperium is still here. It has survived things that should have destroyed it multiple times. The people its planetary system produces, hard, capable, devoted to a purpose larger than themselves, calibrated against the possibility of comfortable alternatives, keep showing up to fight wars that cannot be won, and they fight them anyway, and sometimes they win. The world's as weapons system is not the reason the Imperium exists, but it may be the reason the Imperium persists. And that is the question the Warhammer 40,000 universe asks without ever fully answering. Is a civilization that survives by consuming its people still worth saving? Is the hammer worth more than the hands that swung it? Is the purpose that the Imperium provides to 1 trillion lives, even when that purpose is simply exist to serve, better than the alternative of no Imperium, which may mean no human civilization at all? The Hive World labor doesn't get to answer that question. The Agri-World farmer doesn't get to answer it. The Feral World warrior shipped off to a war on a planet they've never heard of doesn't get to answer it. The children of Cadia, raised from birth to hold a line that eventually breaks anyway, don't get to answer it. But we get to ask it. And the asking is, perhaps, the most honest thing that can be said about a universe that asks so much from the people who inhabit it. 1 million worlds. Some of them factories. Some of them farms. Some of them fortresses. Some of them charnel houses in waiting, orbited by ships carrying weapons that can sterilize their surfaces if the calculation ever comes out wrong. All of them functions. All of them instruments. All of them, in the cold accounting of the administratum, lines in a ledger that measures output and tithe and military contribution and strategic value, and that does not have a column for what the people living on them want for their children. This is the Imperium of Man, the greatest human civilization in the galaxy. The only thing standing between 1 trillion human souls and the darkness that wants to consume them. A civilization that turns orphans into soldiers and planets into weapons and faith into infrastructure and grief into fuel, and does it all in service of a purpose that is, in the impossible mathematics of the 41st millennium, genuinely necessary. It is not good. It is not just. It is not what humanity might have built in a kinder universe. But it is what humanity built in this one. And 10,000 years after it should have fallen, it is still here. Cadia fell. Cadia fell. The great rift opened. Half the galaxy was plunged into the shadow of the warp. The Imperium is still here. That is, depending on your perspective, either the most inspiring thing you have ever heard, or the most horrifying. In the 41st millennium, those two things are the same.